If you have ever seen reviews for this book, you have likely seen one of two things. Either a perfect 5 out of 5 star rating, where people are saying it is one of the best books they have ever read in their life, or you see people giving a 1 to 2 star rating saying that it was very, very pretentious. I'm here to offer you a extremely middle of the ground take on this book, because I don't think by any means this was the best book I have ever read. But I do think there are things that Kingsolver does in this book that are extremely well done. For example, this book, just generally, is about living in Appalachia and some of the systemic issues that they deal with in Appalachia, such as the opioid crisis, such as injustice because of having been given less resources over time by the government and being overlooked, things like that. And those 2 points kind of diverge in this book in the discussions that Kingsolver does. So at some point, the opioid crisis really takes over, and that is what this book becomes about. And to me, that felt like the weakest part of this book. I do think that Kingsolver did justice to the fact that this region is vastly and outnumbered when it comes to the impact of the opioid crisis, and by no means am I saying that she should not pay attention to that. Absolutely she should. It just felt like when we took the turn into Demon as a character and all of his friends also partaking in the opioid crisis, it became an extremely repetitive book. And on top of that, we also reach a moment where the one character that is not involved in partaking in the opioid crisis by getting into drugs is like this hero character. And so it felt like a really weird kind of like moral scale that I wasn't overly a fan of. So that was like the biggest negative of this book for me. However, what I will say is I think Kingsolver does an absolutely amazing job talking about the injustices in Appalachia outside of the opioid crisis. She has this way of talking about language, specifically tied to the use of the word hillbilly, that I think is done really, really well in this book. And I think that she kind of stomps on stereotypes that are around by people who are not from Appalachia by demonstrating how smart many of these characters are in this book, despite accents and whatever it may be. That is the normal stereotype that they are faced with outside of the region that they grew up in. And so I think that she does a very good job with that. At some point, one of the characters leaves Appalachia and goes to live in the city, and there's a moment where the person that he starts to live with is questioning why he won't lock the doors. And he's like, what are you, dumb? Like, why aren't you locking the doors? And there's this whole cultural discussion of how you don't need to lock your doors in Appalachia because everyone is your neighbor and everyone is looking out for you. And it was a very interesting discussion, and I think Kingsolver does a very, very good job in that respect to kind of demonstrate to the reader as well as the characters in the book who are not from Appalachia how different culturally it can be. And so that I think is where her strength really, really shines through in this book, despite the fact that the vast majority of this book is mostly about the opioid crisis. And so I come here bearing you my 3.5 star on this book. I know it is a lot of people's favorite, and that might be an extremely hot take, but it is a lot of people's not favorite, and they gave it a very low rating. And so I just think that it is interesting that there are very few middle ground takes on this book, and so I'm here to offer one to you. I do think it's definitely worth a read. I think one of the reasons that it won the Pulitzer is because of its connection to David Copperfield and that literary connection versus the actual content of the book itself, if that makes any sense. So if you're coming into it thinking that it's going to be life-changing, I personally do not think it's going to be. At least it was not for me. However, if you're coming into it thinking that you're going to learn something and that it's going to be an interesting read, 100% agree with that. I also don't think that this book is pretentious. I do think the connection to David Copperfield is where a lot of people are getting that from, but let's be real, most books are inspired by other books. And so I have nothing critical to say about that. I think that that is a gorgeous thing when art can inspire other art. And so that's how I personally felt about this book. And so I would encourage you to read it, and I would be interested in knowing, anyone who has read it, what your thoughts are.